So are we ready to start?
Oh.
Yeah. Welcome. Organize, Not Agonize is an informal dialogue group of people who are committed to development work using creative and visionary approach. We choose to engage in critical dialogue around all issues related to aid and development, and we are grateful that you are here in our first webinar. We hope it is only the beginning of many more conversations with you. International aid for global development and humanitarian work is a $200 billion industry meant to eradicate poverty, reduce suffering, and make the world a better place for all. However, in recent years, governments and donors all over the world are slashing their aid budget drastically, and the unprecedented number of concurrent emergencies, including the COVID-19 pandemic, has exposed serious weaknesses in the current international aid apparatus. We are seeing that aid financing is unsustainable, needs are not adequately met, and local communities do not have enough of a voice. We're also seeing that new models of development are emerging, some of which are not even complying with the International Humanitarian Code of Conduct. The overwhelming health system crisis and economic recessions and the growing racial protest and civil unrest, especially in the West, or even in the West, is posing a huge challenge and also an opportunity for us to reimagine and redefine international aid delivery. Traditional forms of aid delivery or humanitarian interventions are becoming more and more irrelevant as the impact of humanitarian crisis is becoming more global in its repercussions, and new approaches and players are emerging to fill in increasing gap between needs and response. And I'm thinking of, for example, the China model of development that we now see in so many parts of Africa and Asia. We believe that all of us who are committed to development and humanitarian work must seek a seat at the table and have a voice in the conversation about how we wish a new international aid model should look like. So to help us reimagine and redefine international aid in the context of the growing new threats, including the COVID-19 global pandemic, climate change, which is causing huge and unprecedented natural disasters all over the world, long-lasting conflicts causing endless exodus of refugees and displaced populations, racial and civil unrest even in the so-called developed countries, and the continuous decline in big aid money. So we have here an impressive panel of experts with years of supporting development and humanitarian aid, implementing development programs, promoting and advocating for ethical and moral giving and leadership. And we hope to learn from them not only the importance of redefining and reimagining and redefining international aid, but embracing or applying a new paradigm, a new way of doing business in the world of international aid. So our first speaker for this morning or this evening is Lauren Hatvany, one of the founding members of and the former managing director of Master Seed Trust, based in the UK. Presently, she's based in California and she's an active team member of the Center for Partnership Studies. In her years of work as a philanthropist, supporting projects in Africa, Asia, and also global programs such as ecosystems restoration camps and care economy, Lauren has been a shining example of a donor being an equal partner to projects in the field, seeking partnership and shared learning Lauren continues to share her experience with other donors and philanthropies and engaging with them to advance the partnership model that her own dear friend and colleague Rian Eisler, a renowned social scientist, has developed. Lauren, please tell us more about your work. The floor is open.
Thank you. That was such a nice introduction. Musheshe just tried calling me, so it seems he's attempting to connect with us. First of all, I want to appreciate you, Nita, for conceptualizing this and organizing this meeting. And I am honored, and it's a great pleasure to be with my fellow panelists. And I want to appreciate everyone who's joined us, and hope to hear from you in the chat and or speaking. So I was a funder of NGOs around the world, mostly in the so-called developing world. And in the role of director, I was responsible for identifying, vetting, and building relationships with the NGOs we partnered with. I learned a lot along the way, including what successful NGOs have in common and why a relationship based on principles of partnership is so much more effective and satisfying for both funder and beneficiary than a relationship that is governed by a power imbalance. And I'll speak more about that in a minute. As I was thinking about this evening's talk, I was reflecting on the terms, the designations that have been used in the development world for dividing up nations, ranking nations, first world and third world, and which then became developed and developing countries. And as I went through my years as funder, those terms started sounding less and less relevant. And I wonder why do we not call Africa the first world? That's where Homo sapiens came from. That's the first world. And currently, I think the World Bank is using terms that refer explicitly to how big economies are as a way of ranking countries. So it's really that ranking system is based almost exclusively on a standard set by the West. And it's one that's based on production and consumption. And I think we're all coming to the conclusion that how much a country produces and consumes is not a good indicator of how healthy a society is. And the measurements that the West has been using to rank itself over other countries doesn't see and therefore doesn't measure the quality of human relationships or the richness of a culture or the richness of a natural environment, which in many so-called developing countries is still in the ground. And so I would love to come up with new terms that we could use that flatten the field and get rid of this unfair, unjust ranking system. And the West is essentially imposing its standard of measure of wealth and health on the rest of the world, ignoring the fact that each country has its own path, its history, and its own unique perspectives and resources. And it's on this framework that international aid was built. And it's a very patronizing attitude, very patronizing top-down approach. And I don't think it's meant to be. It's simply that what we in the West know to be right and good, we assume that that's right and good for everyone else. And our brains can't actually recognize that there are other modes and trajectories of development. And that approach has caused a lot of harm. And Rian Eisler, who I currently work with, her Center for Partnership Studies, is a system scientist, and she would describe such a system as a domination system, as opposed to a partnership system, which is based on different principles. Musheshe, who hopefully will show up, is one of the organizations that we funded for, since 2002, Mustard Seed's been funding his organization, and he taught us, and this is a fundamental principle of their organization, that structure determines behavior. So if you have a domination system, it will produce a very different outcomes from a partnership system. It doesn't matter how much money you throw at a problem. If you're operating from the domination paradigm, you will not achieve the results, the healthful, life-giving results that we ultimately want to create. So I thought I would just list here characteristics of a domination system and characteristics of a partnership system. So a domination system has bases itself on hierarchies of domination. So power over, it expresses rigid gender and ethnic stereotypes, and there's a high degree of fear from superiors. And in a partnership system, this is coming from the work of Rian Eisler. She calls it hierarchies of actualization, which is power to rather than power over, an equal valuing of all constituents, and a low degree of fear, because fear isn't needed to maintain the top-down rankings. So I noticed that most of the nonprofits that we supported, we were intuitively attracted to them because they were practicing principles of partnership, even though they may not have been expressing it that way. And I also discovered that as a funder, the best approach for us as an organization, and also for the beneficiary of the funding, was to create a relationship based on partnership, which really means a relationship based on trust and mutual respect. As funders, we have something that NGOs desperately need, which is money, and that sets up an imbalance of power from the very beginning. So, and if that's not thoughtfully addressed, it really sets the tone of the relationship. And I knew that, I realized that once we sent money, that I really had no control over what was done with it. And I also really had no way of knowing what was really happening with it, because funders could come back to me with a report and spreadsheets saying that this and that happened with it. But I really couldn't ever be sure. I wasn't looking at their bank accounts, and I wasn't there on the ground every day. So it was very important that we built a relationship based on mutual trust. And that meant that I needed to come to the beneficiaries with an open mind and heart, and to understand that they are the experts in their field, in their community. They're the ones who know what their community needs. That's not to say that they're not open to collaboration, but it doesn't work to come in with an air of expertise, of being an expert, because expertise may work, a certain expertise may fit the picture in Europe, but it may not translate for so many reasons that we can't understand, that are invisible to us. So it's very important to build that trusting, open relationship. And we learned so much from our partners. We actually took on some of the practices and principles of the organizations that we supported. For example, Musheshe's organization, we learned a lot from them. And it became a very much a back and forth relationship that resulted in tremendous creativity and learning and sharing. So we grew, they grew, and yeah, it was very beneficial to all. And the other thing I realized as a funder, money's really easy to give away. You just get a bank account number and you send it. Cash is neutral. It's how it's invested determines whether an effort is life-giving or life-destroying. So who and what funders choose to invest in can change the course of a community's life for better or for worse. So I was going to introduce Musheshe right now, but he's not there yet. Yeah, so that's what I have to contribute at the moment.
Thank you, Lauren. Just quickly before I let Tim speak, you, because you are based in California, you have the opportunity to meet other philanthropy, not only because you are based in California, but because of your work and your association. You meet other philanthropies around you who want to do the kind of work you do, and sometimes they're at a loss. I remember you telling me that you met a couple who started Twitter or something, and
Yeah.
they say to you that they're asking you, how do we do this? How can we do this? How can we be sure that we are putting money where it is most needed? So how do you determine, or how do you speak to them about where to put the money, where it is most needed, and where it can be invested in a spirit of partnership and not in a spirit of charity giving or feel-good social responsibility?
Yeah.
Giving.
I can talk about the process I went through in determining who to partner with. That vetting process is a long process, but with Mustard Seed, we didn't start out with a domain. We didn't have a focus area. What we mainly focused on was the type and quality of, or the quality and values of the directors. So we got into very close relationship with the directors of the program. And there were some qualities that seemed to go, carry across the board with the successful NGOs. And one of them is passion. So these people are intensely devoted to their project and their mission. Another quality is that what they were doing sort of had a viral quality. So they may be in education or health or human rights, but what they were promoting was a mindset, and often a mindset shift. So something very different from what had been occurring, and they were filling a gap in, societies are constantly evolving. And so they were able to come up with either a program, some kind of educational training, or a service that embedded in it is some kind of mindset shift with tools that can then be passed on, transmitted in a viral way. And then open dialogue. a lot of sharing, listening to, reading the materials, hearing what they're saying, and comparing it with what's on the ground. So sort of seeing if they're walking their talk. And then I always had a third person who I had a connection with who could vouch for them or not. And I am in California, where there is a lot of money. There's a lot of money that's been generated out of Silicon Valley, and a lot of these young entrepreneurs are becoming philanthropists and don't know what to do with their money. There's a ton of money out there, and it's a challenge for organizations to get it. And I don't know what, I think a lot of these young entrepreneurs, they choose a focus area. But yeah, I don't know. Have I answered your question?
Yes, in a way, yes. This is a continuous discussion. And the whole idea of having this discussion is to understand better how to engage the people who need the money and the people who have the money, to build that link between them, and to do it in the spirit of what you just said, partnership and mutual respect and trust. Mm-hmm. And we will come back to you. People, please feel free to write your questions for Lauren if you have any, and for the other panelists. And we hope that we will hear your thoughts on the points that she raised. Our next speaker is the one and only Tim Costello. Tim Costello has recently retired as the CEO and Chief Advocate for World Vision Australia, and he's now serving as the Director of Ethical Voice, and also the Executive Director of Micah Australia, and he's also a Senior Fellow at the Centre for Public Christianity. Reverend Costello is the face of Australia's commitment to international aid. He is constantly engaged in supporting Australia to give more and to do better in development work. In his role as CEO of World Vision, Tim has traveled to almost all the rural communities in the world and has written some amazing books about his travels and his experiences of interacting with people in the communities. So I highly recommend his books to you. And his purpose of engaging with the communities is to learn from the ground on how to make aid work best for people who need them the most. In recent months, Tim has teamed up with Hugh Jackman and others in a campaign called End COVID for All, in which they are calling for Australia to reach out to their neighboring countries in the fight against pandemic. And Tim, I was particularly impressed that you put India also as a neighbor of Australia. That was very generous of you. Thank you for that. Bangladesh, Nepal, Myanmar, all Australia's neighbor, according to your campaign, and we are very grateful for that. So Tim, please do take your time and unmute yourself and tell us about your work and give us some insights.
Well, thank you, Neichu. And last night I was watching on my TV Mike Pompeo from Jerusalem. I might say I much prefer seeing you in Jerusalem, Neichu, and not just because you're more therapeutic to look at, but you and I go back a long way. And I was privileged to do yours and Yaron's wedding some 9 years ago. So lovely to be with you and many other friends on this discussion. So let me just begin with a bit of perspective. NITSA began with $200 billion a year in the international aid sector. Most of it donor government aid, but NGOs, philanthropists, and others. And when we hear a figure like that, immediately we go, well, that's a, sorry, can you hear me okay? Yeah. Okay. When you hear a figure like that, you immediately say, well, that's a huge amount of money and it must be going on corruption, and it's not obviously doing any good, because look at these developing countries, they're still in a mess. Perspective. 200 billion a year works out for the world's 2 billion poor, about $10 a person per year. And when you think about where the large sums of money in our world go, to actually make the jump and say it's all wasted and it's not working and it creates dependency, though there are a number of nations whose budgets internally are far too reliant on aid, that's certainly true. But in terms of perspective, it's still a drop in the ocean compared to where the big money is. And if we're going to look at development in the emerging world or the developing world, the really big dollars and big plays are trade and geopolitics. And a long way behind comes aid and that $10 per poor person a year. And even in Lauren's country, which is magnificently generous, 98% of philanthropic giving goes to America. And, you know, that's why Yale and Harvard have $20 billion plus surpluses. And Lauren, I don't think you'll be offended by me saying that despite huge amounts of philanthropy in America, in terms of child protection measures and well-being measures are down near Uzbekistan, not up as a first world country. And I say that because often we still are labouring with the old paradigm, which started with the Foreign Minister of Canada, Pearman, in the late 60s, who said, if donor governments give 0.7% of their gross national product, and their populations philanthropically give 0.3%, 1% of GDP of the rich nations transferred to the poor will start to ameliorate poverty. And it was a notion that still needs to be questioned. It was, they have a problem called poverty. We have the answer called wealth. If we transfer some of our wealth to them, they won't have a problem. Now, even apart from the fact that most governments, certainly not the Australian government, have ever kept their promise of 0.7%. In fact, private giving has been nearer to 0.3% than most governments ever got to in their donor monies. But even aside from that, that notion of the dominant helping hand, which Lauren clearly analysed, was always going to be problematic in terms of what we're achieving. Now, that for me doesn't let donor governments off the hook, particularly right in this COVID time. If I can just do the macro thing first and then go down to partnership and new models. The macro situation is that advanced economies have injected $13 trillion into their own economies because of the COVID virus. They've raised at least $10 trillion of that on the overseas bond markets. Investors are willing to back governments borrowing, advanced economies. Even when they're getting negative interest, they're paying for it because they get security, they get liquidity. That's worth something in these times of uncertainty. Some emerging economies, Mexico has been able to borrow $5 billion from overseas bond markets. Egypt, about $5 billion. But most developing countries can't borrow a cent. No one's going to lend to them. And the IMF really is the what you'd call the default reserve banker for the world's poor, says the developing world in COVID is going to need $2.5 trillion. And they can't borrow it. They've got debt overhang. We know in our countries, if you've got debts domestically, you resolve that by a bankruptcy or debt restructuring and get another loan. Nothing works like that in international debt markets for developing nations. And as Bill Gates has warned in The Economist, I think today, we're going to see millions more in the developing world die, not from COVID, although they may yet, because of lockdown. And if governments say, no, lockdown means our people are starving, they don't have any welfare system, forget the health measures, let them go out to market, let them go to work. The virus may spread and they may die from COVID. But what Bill Gates was saying is millions are going to die just because of the knock-on effects in developing worlds from the fragile health systems. They are so overrun. They are so fragile. The vaccinations that protect their young are stopping. The sort of development program which saw with the MDGs halving the number of absolutely poor in the world by 2010. By the way, their goal was to halve the number by 2015. We got there in 2010. When people say to you that getting governments on a plan to eradicate poverty doesn't work, the MDGs actually show, not everywhere, but largely they did work. So they're the bigger pictures in a world where government suddenly has become important. Every government in the world's become Keynesian. In fact, even governments with conservative parties ruling have become socialist. There's this massive expansion of the state. And that's that 12 trillion pumped into advanced economies in stimulus. The real challenge, of course, is firstly, to stop the virus and keep people alive. Secondly, to restore livelihoods. Thirdly, to set the growth settings for sustainable, inclusive development. So having this conversation at this time is really important, but we do need to keep perspective where the big dollars really are going in terms of trade and geopolitics, even though we look at 200 billion and say in development, oh, that sounds a lot of money. Even Moya Dambisi, who wrote Debt Aid, you might remember, and said it just creates dependency and it's no good. Zambian woman, worked at the World Bank. Moya Dambisi is coming out, it started nearly 6 months ago, saying we've got to bring aid back. It's not working. We've got to actually be more generous. She's saying certainly more targeted, but her strong argument about it only creates passivity and dependence. She's even abandoned that argument now. Look, in terms of what Lauren said, I can only totally agree. The libraries of the world have lots of volumes on development, sophisticated books you can read. Boil them down, and at one level, the very simple message of what works that comes out of all those libraries is it's about relationship. It's about parity of power. I sometimes call this software. Often in development, we focus on hardware. It's the hardware of a school, a health clinic, a water well, or actually, as important as hardware may be, software is much more important. It's dignity, empowerment, agency, partnership, that sense of saying, it's not us rich nations helping you with a problem called poverty. These are your communities. These are your lives. You are the agents and you take charge. Now, having said that, we must also recognise that communities aren't necessarily, even when empowered, always enlightened. We know patriarchy, we know caste, we know treatment of girls are the behavioural software issues that are very profound. I think I saw Rob from South Sudan, Juba, online. Rob will tell you that it's not just tribalism between Dinkas and Nuers, it's tribal factions within Dinkas who fight for each other. And the curious thing is we're seeing this tribalism, re-tribalising in the world, infecting the West too. How do I know? I watched last week the Democratic Convention. I've watched this week the Republican Convention in the US. You might have well been watching two completely different stories of America. And what really scares me for America is these two different tribes really hate each other's guts, as far as I can tell. And that powerful pulling apart of what America is, and even agreeing on facts, I see as a tribal identity thing going on. And I personally find it scary. We can't just, even when we empower communities, say whatever the community always says is always to be absolutely unchallenged. I remember when responding to the floods in Pakistan, there was nearly 10 million people displaced by massive floods. We're rebuilding some of the communities. In rebuilding the schools, we had to come up with engineering solutions to deal with the patriarchy. Girls were still just expected to get the water and spend a long day walking 5 kilometres, 10 kilometres, and they're out of school. The engineering solution was to build the wells and the taps at school. So a girl could carry her bucket, go to school, fill up her bucket, come home. But it was sort of sad to me that we actually had to, and I think it was a good solution, deal with software, with hardware engineering solutions, because that power is so powerful. Look, I might just finish, Neichu. I've just been reading this book, Isabel Wilkerson, Caste, The Lies That Divide Us. Caste. And she's not talking about just caste in India, though she's talking about that. She's talking about caste in America. She's talking about the backlash, the white lash to the first Black American president. She's saying race is skin color, caste is the bones behind skin. It's a profound consciousness. Now we know caste exists in the communities that we are trying to work with also. We know the software has to be at times challenged, but it has to be challenged relationally. You can only speak into someone's life when you have actually given them agency and when you are there as an equal, not as the benefactor donor standing over saying we have the solution. So let me finish there. I've probably talked too long, but here endeth the lesson, Neichu.
Thank you so much, Tim. You didn't take your full time. You were given 12 minutes. But I'm sure there will be a lot of questions for you. I have a few questions, but I want to keep it for our audience later to have sufficient time to have a conversation with you on so many critical issues you raised here. So may I just remind everybody that please do keep your questions in mind and do engage in a conversation. I see that Musheshe is online. Musheshe, are you there? Can you unmute yourself, please? Yeah.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning, welcome. I'll just quickly.
Can you hear me with the mask on, or I remove it?
Oh, please. You're welcome to remove it. We'd love to see your face.
We can hear you.
Mwalimu Musheshe, Dr. Mwalimu Musheshe is the founding director of Uganda Rural Development and Training Program, an amazing and fascinating program that I've had the privilege of visiting and being part of years ago. He's also the founder and vice chancellor of the first African Rural University, which is specialized in visionary leadership and agroforestry. You can find a connection between those two. It's a women's university, it's a women's university, isn't it, Musheshe?
Yeah, it is.
Yes. Dr. Musheshe is also an Ashoka Fellow, which is a world recognition for social entrepreneurial, as a social entrepreneur. And he's well known all over East Africa for his very popular 24-hour community radio that engages with communities in all issues related to community development. Musheshe's development approach has been studied extensively by many scholars and experts, and is often referred to as an exceptional model globally. Last year, there was a documentary done about his work, especially with his first girls' schools that he started, which has now, I think, multiplied to about 200 girls' schools all over East Africa. And this documentary has received many international awards. I hope he'll tell us more, and do send the link to the documentary on our chat box. Okay. So Musheshe, please tell us more about your vision of the Africa development model and how you experiment that in your URDT and African Rural University work. Yes.
Thank you so much, Neichu, for that very wide introduction. I'm really honored and humbled to be addressing this group this morning, endeavoring to share what our experiences are. The vision for Africa is inextricably linked to the vision of Uganda and also the people of Africa and the region. But I could give you a small background on our motivation to start the organization for not rural development, but rural and human transformation. We had observed over many years that Africa and many developing countries were recipients of very huge types of aid. But then we noted that mostly it was based on the reactive responsive approach. What do I mean? If there was a famine in Ethiopia, there would be local and global mobilization to fix the famine in Ethiopia. Once the famine was perceived to be over, then there would be laxity and people would go about doing their own things until 10 years later, there is another bout. The same thing in our country. We reacted to diseases. If there was cholera, then everyone would be up talking about cholera and how to deal with it. Then they would put their advertisements: don't drink water, which is not boiled, don't eat bananas, don't go in the market, don't shake hands, don't do this. But as soon as it was perceived to be over, then people would not talk about whether you're boiling boiled water or not. They would again lapse. So we said, wait a minute. The community cannot use the knee-jerk approach all the time. That's how we came up with what can really inspire action on a sustainable basis. And we figured people's aspirations rather than the problems, people's commonly held or shared visions rather than challenges and crises might do the real, what we would call, sustainable change. So that's how we came up with the visionary approach. What do we mean here? We mean that people can articulate what they most care about. They want to be healthy, they want education, they want enlightenment, they want peace, they want freedom. But then to crystallize it in a real tangible form in order to be healthy, what do you see happen in your life? Then we would narrow it to good nutrition, clean, safe water, and good housing, where to sleep, good environment, to make sure that the environment is taken care of so that you can have clean, safe water, you can have good soil where you can produce food. Now that list would define the action steps, what they need to do, because they start realizing that handling one thing and not all of it in a holistic way would not actually create health. And therefore people would start saying, what can we start with, which is critical and essential, but every time that is done, they would ask the question, what next? That it becomes their new current reality, and they ask the question, what next? And they keep on with that momentum. Everything that was on their list is a new vision, and once it is realized, it becomes the current reality. Then they move on creating and creating, and to us that is what sustainable change is about. That people are innovating, people are looking at higher areas of intervention, people are working together to see change, and in so doing, we came up with what we call the working premises. One of the working premises is to ensure that people understand that the people of Uganda, like people all over the world, are key to their own development, to their own change. And we affirm what Julius Nyerere said, that people cannot develop people. People develop themselves, but in the process, they can be supported. But there are people who have taken it as their business to develop people, to change people, to do it, and yet people as humans, we believe they have the innate power, they have the wisdom, they have their desires, which should motivate change. But fundamentally, we also say a people with a shared vision can transcend traditional barriers caused by religious, political, gender, and all those prejudices that we have held to ourselves all the time that actually define power relationship, and therefore come together to work for that which truly matters for everybody. To us, that's what partnership is. Is there a vision? Is there a purpose? Do we share? Do we have the same values? Or do we cherish the same values? But we may not even cherish the same values, but we can accept to live in diversity as long as we are working for that which is most important for us. Do we care about good health? Do we care about clean, safe water? It doesn't matter where I'm coming from. If it rains all of us when we are outside, it will not say this is an Anglican, this is a Jew, this is a Catholic, it will all rain on us. And that's what transcendence is about, to raise above the traditional divide in our societies. Now, this one, once it happens, then you have a people who want to work together, who can then demand what they can't achieve by themselves. And that's how the citizenship becomes very important. And that's how the citizenship avoids what we would call political patronage, because they already know what they want. The politicians don't have to tell them what they want. They articulate it themselves. They say, these are our resources. And on those resources, they say, this is what is lacking. If you want to partner with us, then contribute rather than donate. So it was on that basis that we have built pillars of relationship with others. I can tell you we have very great partners in the United States also who used to talk about, let us get out of the box. I say, wait a minute, should there be a box? Let there be no box, so that there is space. But people still talk, get us out of the box, and I said, no, no box. Let us have space for everybody to engage, to participate, to share, and to contribute to the discourse of change. So the African Food and Peace Foundation was, I think, a model in relationship with URDT in the area of co-creating, that we sit together and we ask each other, what kind of world are we living in? What kind of countries are we living in? What kind of communities are we living in? And in that kind of funnel, we can then sieve out what can be done in the States, the intercultural relationship, educating the American people about the Africans, educating the Africans about the American people, and how to share resources, how to contribute to each other intellectually, resourcefulness, and also friendship. I think most important is how do we relate to each other? Much of the aid internationally has been impersonal. You don't even see the face behind the aid itself. Everything is done in an impersonal manner. So African Food and Peace Foundation, we succeeded in building that bridge. We talk as colleagues, we don't talk as donor and recipients. Then also we got another relationship with Mustard Seed, and I'm glad Rolene is here, she can bear witness. Ours again is not donor recipient relationship, is what do we want to see change, the kind of world we want to live in, and how do we contribute to that? What resources do you have? What resources do we have on this side? And then we bring those resources together. In terms of equity, there is no, this is senior, this is junior, but all of us see that we are contributing to the same cause, to the same purpose, and because of that, we build a kind of a new relationship of friendship beyond partnership. Because the partnership, again, has been used loosely, that you bring this chunk of resources, you bring this chunk of resources, then we have equity or we have shares, and therefore we are partners. We say no, there is the human element in how people work together, how people relate to each other, how people actually share the inner sense of who they are. And in most cases in the aid world, we don't explore those things. We meet and smile, we meet and shake hands, we meet and wave at each other. With us, we go beyond waving. We build family across the oceans, across the continents. So our work is based on that fundamental realization that even when we are working with the communities, we don't look at them as recipients of our support. We look at them as people who are partnering with us, and we partnering with them because their life, their community is also our community. And with that realization, there is no power play. It is hi Mwalimu, it is hi George, how Jane, how Kursum, and we don't use even the titles much because titles also distort relationships. So that's how our story starts. And we have been successful in building momentum over years because we are an example of what it is that we should do as humans on this planet, transcend our differences in color, in language, and of course we have even invented what we call common language, music, dance, and drama. It doesn't matter where you are. Music is always beautiful. It sends messages. Drama is always good because you see people in action. So we bring all those into our work to enable communication to be better beyond words so that we can go into action and demonstrate relationship using the intangibles, music, storytelling, folklore. You can't touch, but when you listen to people's stories and you appreciate where they are coming from and where they are going, and you acknowledge that, you build a bond with that person. So the aid should start looking at going beyond the mechanics of objectives of how to spend money, to give money to at times dictators who have no relationship with the communities, to look at the communities, how they relate to their government, all those people who are serving them, so that then we can be at a round table, not a square table. Haven't I talked too much? What do we need? Hello?
Yes, I hear you. You're talking very important issues, Musheshe. We're very grateful for that. You have any more points, or should I open the discussion?
The more points are related to what you said about the African Rural University and all women's university. We have also other schools, and an example is the URDT Girls School. It is also purely women. Why? I learned this from my mother. My mother was my nurturer. She endured, stayed with her for 9 months without complaining. I don't think there are men who can endure that for 9 months without complaining. That power of holding pain and joy at the same time, I think is heavily resident with women. My mother, she was my food store because the breasts made sure that I was fed. And she never complained. Men, when we buy food and the woman says, you know what, salt is finished, you start complaining as if she eats salt like a cow. And yet, the mothers, when milk gets finished, they get herbs and drink in order to have more. Men complain. When I would get sick, she was my nurse. And she had a thermometer in her hands. You touch on my forehead and no, or temperature is high. And we have an expression, who hears the baby cry? It is the mother, when the man is snoring there and then. So with that kind of attention, she's my nurse, she's my feeder, she's my cook, she's my, before I forget, she's the person who feeds the family. She selects the seeds without learning agronomy because it is inherently in her. When she plants, she knows the soils, she knows the season, and yet she's not a meteorologist. She's not a soil chemist. She's not a soil physicist by training. And she will harvest and make sure our grain is not attacked by pests, which means she's an entomologist. Now, if you have someone who is a doctor, a nurse, a pharmacist, because when I would get sick, she would go into the bush, get the herbs, make concoction, I drink and malaria is gone. She was round up. And then we had to ask ourselves, who in this human race has that capacity to do those things without even an education? What would you do and what would you have if you had such a person? Get an education, know how to make research, know how to reflect, know how to think, know how to engage. The woman is the best teacher. And that's why I think if we have as many women leaders in this country, but who have gone through this kind of understanding of the power they have, soft power, but they are like a chain. The strength of the chain is it is flexibility. They are flexible, they are leaders, they are managers, they are teachers, and that's why we said, let us have as many women educated, and educated in a way that they can do self-discovery of the endowment they have in terms of attributes, which then they can bring to the world, and we think the world would never be the same.
Thank you.
So that's why we chose to focus on women. And by the way, the adage is, you educate a man, you educate an individual. You educate a woman, you educate the nation. And this I have a living example. When I go for workshops like I'm doing now, when I go home, my wife will ask me, how was the Zoom webinar discussion? I said it was great, so and so was there, so and so was there. More than one sentence summarizes everything, and I think that is enough. But if it is her, in this kind of gathering, in a workshop, in a seminar, and she comes back home, I'm very careful not to ask how the workshop went. Because if I do that, she will not stop educating me about the workshop. So she's a teacher. She's a repository of information. And I think the more we realize that, the more we build our societies, the more we shift from the aid business, which is still dominant, to the people who are working intelligently, smartly, and hard to actually change their lot and their communities and the nation. And by doing that, they also are changing themselves.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. So we have seen that in your work. I have personally seen how much you invested your whole life in educating girls, and now young girls in the university. And I'm sure there is already a comment in our chat box about the need for more gender inclusive and gender focused programs and how that could make aid more effective. So thank you, Cynthia, for raising that point.
Welcome.
We have about 25 minutes, and I really want people to talk. So I will shut up, and I'll let any one of you ask questions or share a comment with any of our panelists. Just unmute yourself and make sure that you keep your questions or your comments short so others have a chance to also ask questions. Jonathan, you have a point. May I ask you to start? Where are you? Jonathan from Tebel Betzedek.
I don't have a point. I had a question.
Yeah.
Tim, question for Tim. You referred to Dambisa Moyo's retraction of her stance on international aid. I was hoping for to hear more about that. I'm sorry, I wasn't referring to Musheshe.
No problem.
So I'll try and track it down for you. I heard her interviewed on ABC Radio National here, a long 40-minute interview where she actually said, basically, I got a whole lot of things wrong. It had often been pointed out she had been a recipient of aid and had only achieved what she'd achieved because she had been backed. But she was more saying the nature of the capture of poor countries and decreasing donor amounts actually had troubled her so much that she'd revised her thesis. To be fair to her, she was talking about different models, which I totally agreed with. Aid in impact investing, where you actually seek a clearer return, and that's always a challenge, as we know, because if business all believe that investing in sustainable, inclusive growth was good for business, they'd all be doing it. Business is always good at smelling where a profit is. And if it was clearly as simple as impact investing is profitable and there are still sustainable returns, I think we'd see a whole lot more in it. But she was talking about that and other targeted aid inflows. So I'll try and track down that. It was on probably February this year. She was interviewed on ABC Radio.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any more questions or comments from anyone to any of the speakers, or just a passing remark? Please unmute yourself.
Hi there, it's Rob here in South Sudan. Many questions, all raises a range of fascinating threads that could be pursued. I just wanted to pick up one, and if there are any reflections people had. The trust building element is obviously key, but to bring it back a little bit to the material dimension, wondered if anyone had any thoughts on the salary disparities that often exist between international and national staff in a lot of these organizations. And obviously there are different ways of understanding my value other than a salary, yet in a lot of these organizations, the understanding is that it sort of comes a bit from the West, I guess, that your salary reflects your value. And then in the same breath, it's often or sometimes impossible for national staff to move beyond a certain level in an organization without moving outside the country to become international staff in a different context. So I'm just wondering if anyone has any thoughts on that, and if there are any thoughts particularly on ways of addressing it if it is a problem, which it seems to me it is or can be.
Thank you, Rob. Very, very important point here. And I think in our redefining and reimagining international aid, this is an issue that needs a lot of discussion and attention. Lauren, would you like to respond to this?
I would like to if I could, but I haven't been traveling in those circles, so I'm not qualified to answer. It's a very good consideration to bring up. Maybe Tim.
Well, can I say something?
Yep.
With your World Vision work?
Yeah. As you mentioned earlier, that the structure determines the behavior. In the world of aid, the structure of aid is almost a reflection of the structure of individual societies, the hierarchy. And when somebody says the payment is based on the value, because the value here is what they call education in terms of papers. They value what they call experience. Then they value where they are coming from in terms of the country of origin, because that's how the structure is. In our partnership relationship, we say the communities actually give us an opportunity, which is intangible value, to participate in their life, which you can't buy in the market. So therefore, the shift in paradigm is to look, what do the communities actually offer us that is intangible? And yet it is fundamentally important that without it, nothing happens. I will give an example. Look at the World Bank programs, projects, which are dumped on the people. And when the people haven't given them that permission to make those projects work, they stand as white elephants. And the area that is understood, that the people are not ignorant, but they are resisting imposition of aid. But they want to accept aid on the level of friendship and relationship. Even the smallest thing they would take and put it to good use. So we need to redefine the issue of value. Is it in the tangible or is it in the intangible? And once the intangible becomes dominant, then everything changes about aid. And we build fraternity that is beyond the recognition, because then together we can do it.
Thank you. Tim, you want
Yeah,
to
I might just add the pay differentials, Rob, really do reflect what I was calling that dominant paradigm. We have the wealth and the answers. you have the poverty and the problems. And if you listen to us long enough, you'll know the answers. And there's no question that is reflected, has been reflected in the pay structures. Look, I'm proud to say in World Vision, lots of national directors who are from the country or from Africa, or maybe different African countries, and an addressing of that quite seriously. Curious for me that in my 15 years at World Vision, when I started, there are hardly any international development courses. And then they flourished here in Australia and elsewhere. And suddenly you had all these quite passionate, brilliant, well-trained Australians, and it would have been true of Americans and Brits. Right at the very time, we actually had decided on localisation and drive the power and the leadership back to the field. So I've never seen such a surfeit of talent of people who want to work, can't get jobs, and it's right because it should be locally led. So that's going on also. And look, my African friend, I hope won't take offence at this, but there are difficulties too. We always had a policy of making sure the national director, or particularly the HR director in a national office, had checks and balances, because you would find a whole lot of their family or their tribe got employed and paid quite well often. There are difficulties here to negotiate, but I'm glad that that paradigm in part is starting to change. And yeah, even though it's very disappointing for a lot of passionate young first world people who want to do development, they are largely now missing out.
Thank you. When we started having
something small,
yes.
Something small. You see, again, we are falling into a very dangerous region. And this has been also misunderstood by the people outside Africa. And let me say this. When the African director or a minister or anybody who goes to power will put their tribes people in positions of jobs to work so that they can be employed. And the colonialists accuse us of tribalism. Don't the Dutch employ fellow Dutches, and it's one tribe? Don't the French employ the French, and it's one tribe? Don't the Germans employ the Germans? Because your national states, which are structured on tribal basis, you don't see them as tribes. You see them as nationalities, and yet same language, same culture, same belief system, and they employ each other in that setup. So we need to again rethink what a tribe is. But in our approach, we don't believe in those things about tribe, not tribe, and whatever. We believe people can contribute based on the values of what they want to offer. That's why Christians will employ same Christians in the religious project. The Muslims will do the same. And so what are the levels of judgment of tribe, nepotism, corruption, etc., etc.? I think if we open the boundaries, you'll find that everyone is tribal in one form or the other. But what matters is, how does my tribe, how does my religion actually affect my working relationship with another person who is diverse and different. I think that's what we need to stress. And once that is done, then the issue of this is my relative, this is my whatever, will disappear, because we shall be looking at people who share common purpose in a given village, in a given industry, in a given company. So those, yes, exist, because that is the paradigm we have inherited. And the new paradigm is how can we transcend that? And once we do that, it doesn't matter where you are coming from. If you are my brother and you mess up with my work, I would still dismiss you. And if you are not my brother and you do a good job, I will still promote you. So why? Because there are higher levels of relationship. But as of now, many countries and in Africa are operating at a lower level of relationship, of survival and identity. Let us go beyond identity.
Thank you. I think this is the critical element of this whole webinar, is to have these difficult conversations around issues related to aid delivery in the field. So the international, national, community level, and building that relationship of trust, and putting values based on value and not based on identity. Thank you so much for that. Yeah. We'll continue this discussion. When we started writing this, or talking about this, having the need to redefine and reimagine international aid, there was a huge uprising going on in the States, and it was followed all over Europe, and I think also in Australia, also here in Israel, that the uprising against injustice and against racial discrimination, and we saw that there was violence and troubles on the streets. And I remember posing a sort of very controversial question to a friend of mine, and I said, is the West in a humanitarian crisis? Would America need African peacekeeping force? And my friend said, you are so provocative. I said, why not? Why don't we send African peacekeeping force to the streets in America? They need help. And I think that it was like a joke, but it is also something that I've been thinking about, that we, the global community, we are so interrelated and interconnected. Whatever happens anywhere in the world affects everybody, not like before. In the past, as Musheshe said, there's famine in Ethiopia, the whole world goes to relieve the famine. And once the famine is over, we go back to our normal life. But we have come to a point where a conflict in Syria has caused huge exodus of refugees in Australia, in Europe, and the Australian money has now, instead of going to help rebuild Syria, has to invest in refugee absorption programs in Australia, for example. So there is this, anything happening anywhere in the world affecting everybody in ways that we have not seen before. So where do we take this whole element of they and us, and us who have the resources to give and they who need the resources? And how do we reach a point where when you need me, I come to you, when I need you, you come to me? You know, that the feeling that if needed, the Nepali peacekeeping force or the African peacekeeping force will also go to the West to help. Or just an example, or if we need to do a community development work in some of these communities where there's so much despair in say, Chicago. Maybe the experts in Nepal could come and help. You know, so this element of how do we create that space where we could learn from each other based on experience and based on mutual trust and respect. I think this is precisely the reason why we're having this conversation. We have another 7 minutes for anybody to make a comment or ask a question.
I'd like to make a comment, if I may.
Please, yes.
Which hasn't been mentioned. Tim mentioned earlier the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals. But since 2015, the international community adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. And whereas the MDGs were largely about poor countries reaching certain metrics, the SDGs apply to all countries, rich and poor alike, because we are all in an ecological crisis. And I would hope that maybe this is one way that we start to think about poverty, but not only poverty, also environmental degradation, also ways that we have of valuing things maybe need to be different, that we start to think about it differently. And the SDGs in a way give us a way to do that, suggest a range of metrics that could be applicable to all countries. So that's one thing. If we look at the problem not as being a problem only of poverty, but of creating a world that we all want to live in, whatever that means for different societies, and also that we share the one planet. But just building on that also, I started to think about the question that Rob raised about differential pay scales and so on, and how we value what is important to us going forward. It's a human value to help those who are close to us. That's not necessarily nepotism or corruption. It's neighborliness. Sometimes it's being family. If we want to avoid abuses of power, it's good to think about diversity in the workplace, not only about preventing people from being corrupt, but also about having different points of view, different perspectives, and also maybe materially different interests in the mix of staff that we have. That's all.
Thank you. Very important points. Anyone else?
Yeah, can I
Yes.
just respond and say I totally agree with that comment. The truth is, whatever our culture, tribe, whatever term we use, what the world needs is transparency and accountability. And the SDGs saying that advanced economies would have their homework marked, their progress toward climate change or not marked, was a huge advance. And it's why groups like Transparency International are so important, who rank countries according to corruption. And it's not racist, it's actually transparent. The real challenge with the SDGs, as you probably know, has been the world basically said, we're not going to get caught by Jeffrey Sachs again, because Jeffrey came up with the MDGs on the back of an envelope and got them through, which was quite a miracle, the UN, and they were only focused on poor countries. So they said, we're going to have our input and our buy-in, which was good, except we've got too many SDGs. No one can remember the 17 of them. They're so complex. I think it's 265 KPIs and measures. And I can only speak as an Australian. Our government has been let off the hook because they're hard to communicate. They're hard to organise around, as Make Poverty History did around the MDGs, and to get clarity and cut through. They've become very difficult, though they're a superb global plan. So I've been grieving the fact that the MDGs gave us such a focal point to organise around. The SDGs, brilliant as they are, much more complex, has been hard, very hard to organise around and communicate.
Thank you.
Can I say something?
Yes, please. Quickly.
Yes, you are talking about the West being in a crisis. And I don't know whether it was a pun, a joke, or a serious, a serious point about African peacekeeping force.
Both.
Okay. They don't need the African peacekeeping force. In the African Rural University, we decided deliberately to work with people we have called traditional wisdom specialists. These are the people in the communities who bring to the university the knowledge and the wisdom, how communities lived, how societies were organized, how relationships were done, and how they made sure reconciliation can work, justice can be observed. We have issues of blood relationship, blood where you have someone from a different tribe comes close to and they bond. How did it work? How did it build trust? How did it build relationship on a long-term basis? Now, why are we doing this in Uganda? To look back to our history, to find the gem, the gifts we had in nature, which for some reasons, because of global interaction, were distorted, but they are still persevering. The Americans still have the same opportunity to reflect on the Native American. How did they do their things? How did they look at nature? How did they look at the universe? How did they look at animals? How did they look at themselves and the relationship they hold among themselves as the people, the earth, the universe, and how they created peace or created war and resolved the conflict. So they need the Indian peacekeeping force in America.
Thank you. And on that note, I think Australia also has a lot to share.
Exactly. They have to look at what they call the aborigines.
Yes.
And sit down and say, how did you do your things in the past? But again, the structure they have created, this is backward wisdom, this is advanced wisdom, this is a new civilization. What goes around comes around, we have to go back.
Thank you, Musheshe. I think on that note, we are recognizing, and I think the world is recognizing, especially because of all the crises that we are going through with the climate change related disasters, that there is so much wisdom in our own communities with our native nations that we can learn from. And I just want to sort of say that we will have to end this conversation, but it's just the beginning, and I hope that we will continue this conversation. The whole idea is for us to find a space, as Musheshe said, not to create a box, but to create an open space for honest dialogue around aid. And now we also learned the whole global design of how aid, how sustainable development goals were designed and implemented have become complicated, and so that also gives us another opportunity to continue this conversation, to simplify, but also to keep the critical elements of sustainability, inclusiveness, partnership, trust, a visionary approach, Musheshe put it, having a value-based approach, co-creating, and building friendship based on equality and respect for each other. And I think these are the key elements that have been raised. I would try and sort of make some notes and share with you. I have put my email address on the chat box. Anybody can write me, and if you want a discussion, a further discussion on any of the subjects raised, please let us know. And please continue this conversation with your networks. I know that we have an amazing collection of people in various fields of development work here. And I wish that we continue this conversation in the weeks and months to come, and that we are able to redefine our need to reach out to each other and to create this outreach. I see this as an outreach, but also to doing in-reach and outreach. International aid is in-reach and outreach, I always call it. Lauren, would you like to say something before we end as a co-host?
Thank you. Yeah, actually, I would like to leave everyone with a thought, and it's reiterating something that Musheshe spoke about, something that's deceptively simple sounding, and that is that rather than focus on solving problems, which is sort of the clarion call of many nonprofits here in the United States and in development aid, as he described, putting out fires, URDT has focused on not on problem solving, but on creating the life that each individual wants to live, each community wants to live. So it sounds really simple, but it's actually a very powerful approach. It ends up taking you in a very different path. It's a holistic approach, and it's a sustainable approach. And I've seen it in action. And in fact, all of the nonprofits that we supported, in one way or another, they embody this approach. They don't focus on what's wrong. They focus on what they want. So yeah, I just leave that thought for all of us to ponder as we observe how countries and cities approach their challenges.
As I started by saying that we are people who are committed to organizing when we see a challenge or an issue or a problem. We organize, we don't agonize. So the whole discussion is not to agonize on the problems that we see, but to organize ourselves and find a common path for all of us to follow. So thank you very much, everybody, and see you again soon. Then thank you, team, and thank you, Lauren, and thank you, Musheshe, for your inputs. See you soon.
Thank you very much, Nita. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for making this wonderful conversation. And as you said, we continue with the discourse.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you.